conversationalist today. We are joined by Rod McGuinness, who is Community Management Lead over at the ABC, and he's also creator and presenter of the social media self-defense training for ABC TV, which is a first ever initiative for that organisation, and pretty unprecedented overall. There are a number of people looking at that type of stuff now, but very few have gone ahead and built a program yet. So Rod is a true pioneer in that space, and we're really excited to hear about that. We're also joined by the lovely Nicolle White, the ABC's first ever social media wellbeing advisor. Nicolle also has an illustrious career in social media and online community, as does Rod, who worked for a bunch of different organisations before they joined the ABC. So we're going to talk about resilience. We're going to talk about the work that these two do, the challenges that they face working at the ABC with their teams, and they're going to offer practical tips for you all. Welcome, Rod and Nicolle. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Good. How are you, Nick?
Yeah, I'm good. I feel like I've seen a lot of Rod today, so that's always good. Yeah, very good. Excited to be here and have this conversation. I think it's a really important one.
Yeah, me too. So first, I'd just like to briefly ask you both, as we do with all of the folks that join us for Yarns, how you both kind of stumbled down the rabbit hole of working in online communities, because it's not really a linear pathway for most people, we find. I think maybe it will be in another decade, but at the moment it's still kind of we get there through really interesting routes sometimes. So I'm curious to know how you both came to work in this practice. Rod, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I social media in my job title was the first time when I worked at the ABC, started 10 years ago. And the role was to manage the social media accounts for all of ABC Radio. And so that was everything from local radio, which is like 55 radio stations, Triple J, Radio National, and so forth. And so I started off doing a lot of strategy and policy and compliance within the ABC and how they manage social media accounts. But what I was also doing a lot of was supporting talent and presenters with the work that they were doing and the abuse they were receiving and difficult, people online. And that has really, in the work I've been doing at the ABC, I guess, directed things like that social media self-defense course, but also the support for the ABC staff and also the ABC audience and ABC talent that appear in our TV programs and elsewhere. And so it's really come from that. And, I've learned a lot in the last few years about the limitations of law enforcement, the limitations of the social platforms. But the work now, just in the last couple of months with this community management team, which is the first dedicated team in my division to support all of these social accounts that we have. So yeah, it's kind of the way I've ended up here.
Awesome. It's a fascinating journey, and we're really keen to pick your brain on some of those points that you raised, definitely. Nicolle, what about you? How did you end up where you are in this pioneering role at the ABC?
Yeah, I think I'm one of the rare ones where from the get-go I was in social media. I think being the youngest person at the company I was in, that just got handballed to me straight away. So all of a sudden I was a specialist. And working in I worked in the backpacker travel industry for a while before this. So that was very social media focused, given the audience. And then I came onto ABC as the social media producer originally. So I was on the front line working across some of our key accounts and training a lot of staff in how to post to social media and coming up with strategy in that space. So yeah, recently the role became available about 3 months ago for a social media wellness advisor. And I also have a background in psychology. So it seems like a good mix of both my skills. And I think it's so great that the role exists and it's such an important one. So it's definitely the most millennial job in the ABC currently. I think I'm 3 months in and that still gets laughed, so I'm still rolling it out. But yeah, it's a really important one. I think everyone's still getting their head around what the role actually means, but it's great.
Well, that's a good segue, because I was about to ask you, what does the role mean? What is your remit as you understand it?
Yeah. So as Rod alluded to, our staff do experience a lot of negativity online, to put it lightly. And so my role is really creating strategy and managing that. So responding when there are incidents, working with managers to make sure that those staff are supported and we have processes in place to ensure that when things happen, there's a SWAT team that comes in, people know what they need to do. So initially creating that strategy, but then broadening that. We know that a lot of our staff have particular subsets of our staff are more likely to experience abuse, such as, say, women, our Indigenous staff, LGBTQI plus staff. So making sure that we have specific strategies in place for them, and really looking at the workflows that we have and, how can we reduce even the exposure to such incidents. So both responding to and trying to decrease that overall, because it is something that we're taking really seriously.
Yeah, it's a fantastic role, and that's a juicy, important, amazing remit. And I think, everybody can learn a lot from it. I think I want to just touch on something you said, which I think is key to so much of this, which is, I think people and organizations have generally gotten better in the last decade at dealing with bad things when they happen. So, somebody's attacked, trolled, there's a misinformation, coordinated assault, whatever it might be, something shady is going down on the internet affecting your people or your organization. We've gotten a bit more sensible about having a little bit of a plan to deal with that. But I still don't think we think really enough about preemptive measures. Now, obviously, there's only so much you can do, as you alluded to, Rod, limitations of both platforms, law enforcement, and, just human beings in general. We can only do so much, and hate is going to hate, as they say, but this is a long way beyond that. This is, creating healthy communities that can, in and of themselves, act as a buffer for some of this sort of activity. We know, all of us, and I think everybody listening probably understands that, really well run, effectively community managed digital spaces do, produce a communal collective resilience to some degree that can actually be a disincentive to certain people to come in and attack or invade that space, because they know that, there's a level of self-governance. People want to defend and protect that culture that they have there, and that it's not an easy target, basically. Whereas spaces that are, have less attention on the moderation or community management front are in many ways more likely to attract some of those people, because they see them as an easy target or even a worthy target in their mind. So could you both talk to some of those how you think about that distinction between, kind of before these things happening and how you can engineer before the fact versus, some of those strategies you have to deal with afterward. I think that's an interesting perspective. Rod, what about you? How does your training work, for example?
Yeah, look, a lot of the things that we deal with, you can sometimes preempt. If we're doing a story that we know is going to be controversial, or if we're talking about a subject matter that is going to get a big reaction, to a large degree, you can sort of preempt it. But the reality is also sometimes we have conversations or we see things that we didn't expect, or people, interpret things in a way we didn't presume. And so I think it's really important that we're just mindful that every day there can be difficult situations and challenges as well. And, we talk about resilience a lot. I think resilience for people who are going online, resilience, I guess, it's having that toughness, but it's also having that self-awareness or that sensitivity of what is going to affect you, or what can affect you, and having a barometer of, when you're stressed or when you haven't had enough sleep, and then when your resources are a little bit low, and knowing that things are going to have a bigger impact than they would perhaps a week ago when you were feeling refreshed because you just come back to work from a break, etc. So what we try and do is be really mindful of, preempt things. If we're doing a story about vaccinations, anti-vaxxers are running wild at the moment on social media. And so we can, to a large degree, preempt what the type of response is going to be. But also when things suddenly blow up or pop up from out of nowhere, it's also knowing within the team things that could really trouble or be problematic for them, and also just communicating. We have a huge, I think, having Nick as the wellness person is a great, acknowledgement of how seriously we take this, but it's also being really candid that this is the reality for people that manage communities online, that it can be really upsetting and distressing. All jobs can, but this in particular you can be exposed to all sorts of things. So it's being candid and people just saying, hey, I'm really being affected by this, or I'm really, being impacted, or this is really getting me down. And having that real, I guess it's transparency, that openness about it, and not, I think, even for the ABC, coming a long way from, you just got to have a thick skin. You've just got to switch off, go to the pub, we'll have a few drinks and we'll talk about it. That's not always a great idea. And I think we've come a long way from that sort of view.
Yeah, no, excellent point, Rod. What about you, Nick? Would you agree with what Rod said? Anything you'd add?
Yeah, wholeheartedly. Having been on the front line, particularly as a social producer for a few years prior to this role, like, you need resilience to do this job. I think broadly, anyone who's managing an online community and on social media needs that to withstand just the ugliness and unkindness that you're exposed to. And then when you sort of look at it from the perspective of a news broadcaster, and we're talking about politics, we're talking about, articles that are written from the perspective of minorities, really amplifies that. I think these days on the internet, there's such different social norms. People say it's just the internet, or they're bolstered by this anonymity and lack of really like any sort of regard for what they're doing, and any responsibility for what's said. So, if you can work in this role and be exposed to those sort of things for 40 hours a week and walk away with a continued faith in humanity and the kindness of others, as well as the enjoyment of the role and faith in your ability and what you're doing, then you're pretty resilient. Yeah.
No, that's great. I completely agree, and I think I've been there certainly, and I think many listening to this conversation have. I think you touched on an important point there, Nick, about the fact that some people sort of dismiss or marginalize this sort of stuff as it's just online, it's just the internet. I remember one of the first most serious incidents I had with a really vicious serial pest when I was head of community at Lonely Planet, which really besieged our team for a long time, a number of years. And some of the stuff that went down was absolutely hideous. And whilst I definitely had many sympathetic and empathetic colleagues, and some managers that really wanted to understand, that they didn't fully, and certainly when things happened that did actually kind of veer into criminality, law enforcement was deeply unaccepting and not willing to have that conversation, and said, much like you said before, switch it off, go home, have a beer, just chill out, or maybe just don't log on. It's my job, first of all, and second of all, these are death threats. So I think we have progressed a long way, which is really great, but there are definitely still some gaps to close. I'm curious about, you both talked about resilience. It is the theme of today's conversation. How do you both define it? Because I think it is also a word that gets a little bit flattened and simplified sometimes when people just assume, as you said, just a thick skin, whereas I think it's more complex and definitely more nuanced than that. I think, Rod, you were talking about understanding the self, kind of that self-literacy of where your coping levels are at. Could you both speak to that a little bit?
Nick, you go first.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of what I was saying, that the ability to just contextualize what you see, like particularly in an online context, to be able to put that in a box and leave it there and not have it infiltrate your life when you leave work, and not have it impact how you feel about the work that you're doing. Things like if you're seeing denigration of the work that you and your colleagues are doing day in, day out, which is something a lot of our community managers do experience, not having that impact solidly how you feel about the work that you're doing, and the importance of that. And yeah, as I said about the just the kindness of general population, I think if you can uphold that throughout what you see online, then you're doing pretty well. I mean, yeah.
Rod, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, look, the only thing I guess I would add is that I think resilience doesn't just come in of itself. And by that, I mean, I think you have to draw on different tools or have different strategies depending on the situation, because things change. Sometimes you can spend a day moderating or doing your role, and regardless of what you read or see, you can be unaffected by it in a deep, significant way. And then another day, it kind of just bumps you around, really starts to knock you around. So I think the resilience, it's really important to know the times when you can say, you know what, when I finish work, I'm not going to go back online for to search stuff, or I'm going to do yoga, or I'm going to, go to the shops, and I'm going to sit in the park eating an ice cream, and I'm not going to look at my phone. When I finish work, I'm going to say to my family or my friends and stuff, can we not talk about coronavirus, and put that out there, because I've been reading about it all day, and I've read all the conspiracy theories, and I know everything. I've done the research. But I need to demarcate that space. Another thing I do is I have playlists and YouTube search terms that I know that even when I'm working, take 5 minutes out of the day. I search things like dogs greeting their veterans who have returned. If you search that on YouTube, and yes, I know that will give me, that will make me feel really good about the world. That will make me feel really warm and fuzzy. And if I do that for 5 minutes, and then I can get back into what I need to do in terms of work. So it's those sort of tools in a way that for me, and know when I can go, right, I need to do that. I need to call on this, or I need to, make that decision, because, sometimes when community management, it just feels like a hard slog. And I know for ABC staff, sometimes they feel like they're the last line of defense, holding back the hordes of, angry, irate, abuse. And that's a horrible situation to be in, to feel like that. And, and then you add on things like defamation and the legal consequences, and that real anxiety of, if I fuck up, to be honest,
serious consequences.
What's the implications of that? And so, the resilience to be able to know I've got to take care of myself, and that responsibility, and talking about with other people is super important.
Just adding to that, Rod, I think you're so right. It takes a lot of self-awareness to know when you are edging towards the point of burnout, for instance, because of managing this. And really, you need to have that emotional intelligence to know what are your signs before you actually break, so that you can go watch returning vets and their dogs.
Yeah, I think we all need to do that after this. Let's all watching at least one of those videos when we finish. No, that's terrific. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you about, I know because I've had the pleasure of working with you as well, that you have a really great community of practice around this work at the ABC. You have a lot of people doing the work, which is terrific. So that's part of it. And you've over time built up some really great, sub-communities within different teams and different brands within the ABC, and a broader community of practice that can, offer each other peer support and share lessons with one another and different insights and tips, and just sort of, do it's sort of extra buffer to do those check-ins, have the "Are you okay?" kind of conversations. I wondered, obviously that's magnificent, and you could always keep working on it, but that's kind of the gold standard, I think. Obviously, not everybody's going to have that. They might be the only person in the organization working on, on any kind of digital frontline. That's really common, we know, increasingly when we're working kind of leaner and leaner during these times. So I wondered if you had any tips for those solo operators or people who feel a little bit more isolated and don't have the support of that internal community of practice, on how they can either seek to build that within their organization, or other things that they may be able to draw on individually.
Nick, do you want to go?
Yeah, I can totally kick off. I think it sounds really simple, and I feel like someone's mum telling them this, but self-care, making sure that you exercise and you get enough sleep and you eat healthy, like those things bolster your resilience, so that when you are dealt a blow, you can manage it a lot easier. And that's something we really promote to our staff, as well as digital hygiene. So, having times where you switch off. I mean, I personally don't have a phone in my bedroom. I try not to look at screens as much as possible out of hours. I don't have social media notifications. my self-care really looks like getting offline. I live in northern New South Wales, so, I finish every day relatively by going for a swim in the ocean and sort of clearing the day off, which I'm super privileged to be able to do. But finding what it is for you that switches off, I think it's so important when you are dealing with this sort of content, because it can get you down. I think having support networks, even if they're not at work, or, if there's a previous colleague that you've worked with who's working in the same sort of space that can relate to what you're experiencing, or I'm not sure, even through, the ACM, if you can chat about these things and have those conversations so that you feel like you have a space to vent even. I know it's something our staff do a lot. We've got, Teams chats with staff where they can go in and be like, oh, look at this post I saw, and it just stops it from being internalized, which is so important. And for us, and I mean, we're lucky to have managers that prioritize this, but if you do have the capacity within your role to add some light and shade, so if we know that someone's moderating something that's tough, following it up with something fun, like finding, the best Kelpie UGC of the day, or that they can then share.
Noticing a theme.
Yeah. Just something to shake it up, because, if you're in that space for too long, I genuinely refer to it like a paramedic. They say paramedics really shouldn't do that job for longer than 7 years. And I think it's a bit like that. You need to make sure that you break up doing this sort of work, because it's really like, it's the online forefront of hate sometimes for us. So we really need to, make sure that staff aren't just sitting in that for a really long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting idea about the 7-year cap. Maybe we should do that. Did you have anything you wanted to add on that, Rod?
Yeah, look, for my team, we do try and mix it up so they're not moderating for a full shift, because it's just not sustainable. And so we're able to give them other roles. So I get them to come to strategy meetings and brainstorm sessions, so they can hear about content that may be coming through the pipeline, but also put forward ideas and say, hey, this audience really love this, or they really respond to that. And that can be of huge benefit to the editorial side and content makers. We also get them to do things like do caption checks for videos that we're going to post on social media, come up with headlines and things. And that, it's a different part of their brain to use, and that creativity. And it just breaks it up. You've got to break up the day and have those things, because, hiding and banning all day, that's brutal. Look, the other thing, I suppose, for the ABC, it's a big bureaucracy and it has a lot of staff. And that's part of the reason why we're able to do this, is because big bureaucracies have these processes and things. And I think for smaller organizations or people who are just, it's just them doing the community management, one of the things I would suggest would be to just communicate to managers and the people around you what it is that you deal with, what it is that's happening with you. Because, if a business had someone throw a brick through their front window of their premises, or got an abusive, threatening phone call, a lot of other people in the company would probably know about it. Now, it's online, it's not always extreme, and it's not always as serious as that. But over time and over days, that the impact of those things are as serious and can be as threatening and traumatic as well. So I think it is really important for community managers to communicate in a way that they feel is appropriate, the types of things that they're dealing with, so that there isn't a surprise, whether it's the CEO or the marketing manager or whoever, when they suddenly go, oh, I had no idea this was happening, or I didn't realize the scale of it. And not as to sort of say, look, I hate my job, look what I'm dealing with. But so that the rest of your organization has that insight and can actually think about ways, what can we do better? What can we change? Or how can we support you in a better way? And to be honest, I'm not a psychologist, but I know that if you read this stuff each day and you feel like it's yours to the burden you have to carry, that's not good. And, you need to be able to say to the people around you, and it's not necessarily because you need to debrief about, but just go, man, this dickhead who was on our Facebook page today is really on one. This is what they said. And just verbalizing, just sharing that with someone else gets it out of your head. So, those sorts of things I would really recommend. And in a way, almost to start that conversation or to make a broader, people that your colleagues realize the type of things that you come across.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And as Nicolle said, that it stops it just sitting there internally and being internalized. Even just the sheer act of getting it off your chest has value and meaning. But if you can use that as an opportunity to genuinely educate your management, your leadership, your peers in what it is that you do, that's terrific. I think that's something certainly, ACM as an organization advocates doing that, for all community practitioners kind of as early in their tenure in their role as they possibly and reasonably can. And we try to offer tools for that so that you can, whether it's about this side of thing or whether it's about, understanding how to measure value in a community so that you can kind of get on the front foot of that conversation before it gets awkward down the track, giving you agency to do that. And I think because so much of what we're talking about is really disempowering, and we can't, as you said, we can do some preemptive things, but we generally can't make the internet a perfect place with the snap of our fingers like Thanos. So we have to deal with it. And it's disempowering. We don't have a lot of agency usually. So finding ways to build that agency, whether it's, as you said, offering creative input, being able to close the feedback loop and say, well, here I can actually apply some of what I'm learning on the front line practically, productively for the organization. All of those are the small opportunities that build up for somebody to feel like they have some control over this situation. And I do think that's really important. We have an excellent question from Jane in the chat that I'm going to ask you guys. How do you support managers to identify burnout? What tactics can you use to support your team members? I.e., you're concerned about the behavior of a member of your moderation team and can see that they're stressed. But in one-to-one meetings or when you have that "are you okay" chat, they say they can handle it. So how do you, I guess in that education vein, teach and support, give your managers, your direct manager or other managers in the organization tools to recognize the signs and signals of what you're dealing with?
It's a really good question, and something we have been focused on. Our managers have done training in regards to spotting changes in mental health and understanding the mental health continuum, as have our staff, which is really important because even colleagues pointing something out, like colleagues might notice a change in another colleague's behaviour because they might be closer than the managers, but it's really vital that our managers know their staff well, which is really hard when you're working remotely in particular. It can be really hard to spot that change, but we have sort of guidelines that point out some of the things, like if all of a sudden someone is procrastinating all the time, or they're a bit more argumentative, or they seem disengaged, they're signs that that person might be experiencing burnout. So it really is about just conveying that to managers. And we've got a sort of guidelines for how to manage staff that are working in this space, and that actually includes that, so that managers are aware of keeping an eye on staff. Because, you can say as much as you like, talk to me about what's happening, but particularly in this industry, you've got a lot of type A personalities who want to show that they're doing a great job. And even though we communicate and say it's not a reflection on you if you're struggling, it's a byproduct of the role, and by all means feel open to speak to us about it, you also need to be able to pick out those things yourself and know when staff member might not be speaking up.
Yeah. What about you, Rod? Would you have anything to add for Jane?
Oh, look, Nick, totally, that's spot on. The one thing that we've been doing for the community management team is documenting things that they do through the day, so that they have, you need a handover report so that the next person on will know what they're potentially dealing with or need to look out for. But it's also a way for them to, communicate where, their feelings on things. And I don't know, Vanessa, Nick, I've talked about this before, but we get them to, at the very top of the report, the first thing that they have to highlight something that made them lol. And it's really important that they remember that there is funny, we keep going back to social media for some reason. Why? Because there's things on there that we love and that make us laugh, and there's cleverness and, and joy. And so even, when we maybe moderating some really horrific stuff, or it's really argumentative and draining, that they can point out the thing that made them laugh. And often it can be someone saying something that they would like to say in response to another audience member, or it could just be really...
That sounds like a great tension release.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what it is. And I check in every day with the team. We do, working from home, it's so hard, but check in every day. And I think for everyone, particularly this line of work, because suddenly you are, deleting things and reading things that you wouldn't by choice be doing in your home normally. And suddenly it's in your home space, and there isn't that demarcation between work and home. You don't have the commute to debrief in your head and, or to prep yourself for going into it. It's there, it's in your living room or in your study or wherever. And so I think that's something for managers to be really conscious of as well. We try and get our team to move around a bit. If the cicadas weren't going crazy right now, I'd be in the backyard doing this, but you wouldn't be able to hear me speak. But being able to physically move around stuff and those sorts of things as well, and asking what they're doing on the weekend. What is there something they're looking forward to? They sound like no-brainers, but for managers, I think it's really important to have just a sense check on just how people are really going. And again, being open enough, as Nick said, it's not failure to say, you know what, I'm really struggling, or I really feel knocked around by what I was moderating today. That's actually that honesty, because you don't want someone in 6 months' time to be going, I'm so burnt out, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, no, exactly right. That's the ultimate preemptive move right there.
Rod had a really great example that we discussed a few weeks ago where, sometimes if you ask your staff, are you okay? They'll be like, yep. But if you say, what are you hiding and deleting at the moment? And that might spark a conversation that then gets them talking about like, oh, actually, yeah, I saw this really shitty thing today. And you can go from there. I think that's a really great tip that I just stole from Rod and told you all.
Yeah, that is an excellent tip. I think that's the thing, isn't it? Finding different ways to have these conversations, and kind of rather than just the are you okay models. It's a great broad approach, but it doesn't always work that neatly. And I think we definitely, most people, particularly in a work context where they may feel that they're going to be judged or assessed harshly, or as you said, Rod, that that's a sign of weakness or perhaps incapacity to do their job somehow. They're less inclined to be open and transparent and say, actually, it's really tough right now, or I'm really struggling with this. It's not a sign of failure. We have seen, obviously, in the last decade, really, but certainly in the last 5 years, more and more stories in the press, more and more scholarship and research about the work of moderators, not always community managers, but particularly kind of those bulk contract moderators that the platforms engage, but even so, some community managers and some social media managers, and the types of challenges they face. Amber has actually just shared another one in the chat about the burnout issue. What changes have you both noticed? You've both done this work for a while, both with the ABC and outside of that. So I'm just curious to know, I guess, both positive and negative, how have you seen how we talk about and how we think about this problem change over time?
I can kick off if you'd like. I suppose for me, from coming outside the ABC, I had very little awareness of this, to be honest. Our audience is always really kind. And then you come into the ABC and it's a fairly different world. But for my time in the ABC, I think the fact that this role exists now is a massive shift. I know in my previous role, I had bosses that were so supportive, but they just weren't conversations that were particularly being had, because it just wasn't where we were at. So I think that the fact that, you know, even today we're sitting here and we're having a panel conversation on this, it's obviously something that is really being recognised as a risk to the staff that are working in that area and a real issue that we're all facing. And I think it really is coming from the top down. You know, the managers have to speak about it, and then it flows down, and the rest of the staff will as well. In terms of the actual conversation happening online, I think the last 12 months has been some of the worst. Would you agree, Rod?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's almost like war stories. You know, I think the last couple of years, and particularly for the ABC, it sort of comes in this peak where there'll be a controversy and, you know, the front page of the Daily Telegraph or News Corp, and then we sort of have to endure a week or two of the fallout from that. But I think the shift really, I feel like for managers in particular, is a realization that the angry person on social media isn't necessarily just a single person who's an aggrieved customer or someone who has, you know, homophobic or racist views. That there's a level of sophistication now of the things that we deal with. You know, that guy who, you know, has just been impeached again, you know, when they talked about the mobilizing movements online, you know, whether they're from Russia or from, you know, anti-climate change, you know, the fossil fuel industry, and I think that there's an understanding that these things are much more sophisticated, that there are bad actors and things. And I think the realization that it's not just dealing with, you know, a crank or an individual, but that you know, Facebook in particular, but all social media is big. The ecosystem is now, part of it is these very, very, you know, nefarious movements or people that want to undermine and threaten influence, all the rest of it. And I think that man, that's a whole other topic, but it's, you know, that is something that we deal with every day in different ways. You know, I said before about the anti-vaxxers and thing, you know, there's some really big, you know, you often see the same comment, like exactly the same comments from different people, but this understanding that we're not just dealing with a couple of, you know, aggrieved individuals, that it's things that are really combative and have a strategy behind them to, you know, disrupt.
I think on the more positive side of things, although it seems like things are getting worse, I think we're also getting more sophisticated in how we respond to it. So we have really strong moderation policies that outline, if this happens, you know, this is what you do, which is great for our staff because you don't have to sit there and second guess and go, oh, should I be doing this or this? So that really helps, but it also means we have stronger, more positive communities because we're more onto it. I know, for example, I worked on a documentary that it was expected would have quite a negative impact, but there'd been a documentary just before on the same topic, and they received it, and they did a lot of heavy lifting in cleaning up the trolls, really, and cleaning up the community. So when the documentary that I was working on rolled around, I was like bracing for the worst, and it was genuinely pretty positive. So that was a really positive outcome to see that, okay, like you do the heavy lifting here, you're not going to get rid of everyone. But as you said at the start, Vanessa, the more you show, look, we're not going to stand for this, then you do not completely stop being targeted. Like ABC News is never going to be a playground of joy, but it does seem to help, I think.
Yeah, I do think that's an important point. I think that a change that I noticed was, you know, in the early days of social media and online communities, I've been working in this space for a fair while. So, you know, I was sort of around pre-social platforms in those early online communities. Then social platforms came along and changed it up a bit. And then they themselves have changed a lot in the last decade. And I have noticed that initially, in my experience, in my observation, people were early on pretty happy to do that stuff you're talking about. So we were pretty, you know, our default setting was, yeah, we're going to set meaningful boundaries and we're going to build a healthy culture, and we don't mind saying, you know, we think this community is not for you, or actually just get out because you're nefarious bad actor. But I think that with the mainstreaming of social media and how intractable it's become from so many businesses and organizations, it is a principal communication tool, a principal marketing tool, sales tool, and that's largely a positive, I guess. But it's normative now for everybody. And I think that it attracted commercial pressures and expectations and some of these other things, people became, in my observation, a little less inclined to hide things, to delete things, to shut things down. And they did have a lot of, social media experts out there, sometimes well-intentioned, saying, no, it's a bad idea. Like, you've got to be real and social. Don't ever delete comments. I think the intent was, don't shut down genuine criticism of your product or service or business, which is correct. But I think that got maybe a bit misread or mistranslated as to, just be hands off. It's the people's tool. Just be there and deal with it. And I've seen that in play in some fairly significant organizations where that's actually been their approach, and it's really surprised me. So I think that maybe the pendulum is swinging back in the wake of, the events of 2020 and all sorts of different changes socio-politically all over the place. I think that we're realizing that, no, we're within our rights to, and not just that, it's the right thing to do for ourselves, our organizations, and our actual community members. They don't want to come and participate in a space that's, full of trolls and bots and bad actors and creepy people. It's in our interest to build a healthy space, and we'll do our best to make sure everybody has a chance to be included, and, a diversity of voices and all of that. It's not about building a homogenous culture, but there are certain types of behavior that are just not on, and we're going to draw lines. We have to get back to drawing some meaningful lines. And all of this is really, I think, whether it's personal self-care or the work that you do, it's, the art of boundary maintenance, all of it. We have a great question from Megan, if I could ask you folk. How do you balance creating a positive and constructive community by removing comments and not stifling debate? We can get hate sometimes if we hide too many comments. Exactly on point with what we're just talking about. And I think that it's a tightrope that you have to walk. So what would you both say to that?
It's a tightrope at any time, and it's a tighter rope when you're at the ABC, which is impartial and trying to find that boundary. I mean, I remember when I started, I was terrified to hide anything. It's really hard. But I think you have to empower your staff by setting clear guidelines of what is okay, what you are going to take, and what you're not. So when you're in the heat of the moment, you're not sitting there not knowing what to do with that comment. The more clarity you have around, okay, this is what we want in our community, then it becomes a lot easier. And if your staff feel empowered, then it's a lot easier to uphold that. And I think, it just comes back to the fact that, yes, okay, we're not going to let people be racist on our platforms, for instance, because if they are, you actually stifle a whole other community who don't feel like they feel safe, or, you get people who are, particularly misogynist, and then we have parts of our audience, like our female part of our audience, that feels like I can't comment on here. So it's really finding the boundary of what you will put up with and what is a respectful debate. And I think you really get a sense of, okay, who's here to stir the pot and who's here to actually have a valid conversation. And often for us, what we find is if someone makes a comment and it's sort of on the line, if you reply and say, and you either try and have a respectful conversation with them, or if someone else in the community does, you can tell from their replies whether or not they're actually a genuine player and wanting to have a discussion, or if they're actually there to detract. And so it's nuanced, but it's trying to figure out who's who and whether they're actually legitimately having a conversation with you, or if they're just being jerks.
Rod, did you have any feelings on Megan's question?
Yeah, look, it's really hard. Certainly, if you're trying to shift a community away from where it currently is, and you think because it's not a good position, and I think a lot of it comes down to that, what your posting strategy is. Because if you're really clear on what you're actually asking of the audience, or you're saying this is what this post is, we're having a discussion, and this is what we are framing the discussion as, so that as soon as someone who is they're outside of that parameter, the vaccination discussion, debate at the moment, if you do a post that just simply says, there are vaccinations coming, what do you think of vaccinations? You're going to get everything. And you can't suddenly come back and go, hang on, no, you can't post a conspiracy theory or, fake medical advice, because you asked, what do you think of vaccinations? And the audience told you. But if you frame it specifically around something and align it, then as soon as someone is outside of that, you have much clearer grounds to be able to say, you know what, no, that's not what this discussion is about, and framing it. And the audience know that. And if they don't know that, you need to communicate to them and remind them or establish that as well. And I can see Jane's question there, which is a really good one, about where that community is sort of different to the legal position or editorial standards as well. The ABC, we have lots of communities, lots of different ones. And the Triple J, Facebook community, what's tolerated there, or what the tone and the discussion is very different to the ABC classical music position as well. One of the things I think that can really help is, sort of having that playbook for an account. And it's really saying, not only what is the tones, what are the words that we use and the words that we don't use? Like, do we say thank you or do we say thanks? Even down to that detail. But also really framing, what is the strategy for this account, and what is the space or the area where we accept some things and where we don't. Triple J to a degree self-moderates, where someone will say, Megan the Stallion is a disgusting blah, 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 because that person has very strong feelings about it. And it's usually a white male who has strong feelings about it. And the community, they will respond. And we don't necessarily need to hide that comment. We don't necessarily need to get involved. But if it's on ABC Classic and someone says, Tchaikovsky was a terrible composer and, it stinks and stuff, it's like, no, that's crosses a line, because that's not the tone that or the strategy for the classic page. So I think it's really being clear on that. What do you tolerate, and also what do you want? What does the community want?
Absolutely. I think all of this, all of your governance, when you moderate, how you moderate, why you moderate, through to your attitude to resilience as well, it should marry up, or at least operate. It should basically operate in concert with your community purpose and culture. And to your point, Rod, the tone, the way conflict is played out and dealt with on the ABC, whether obsessive group versus the classics page versus Radio National versus something else, of course they're going to be different. And whilst there's a broad set of standards and practices and processes that your teams draw on, and there is context to its expression and how it is actually deployed. And I think that's really important. One thing I just wanted to add for me, if it's helpful, how I frame moderation is, in one way, is to think of it in two ways. You've got your regulatory side of things, the legal stuff. So as the team was saying earlier, you can't allow things that are defamatory to stay up there, hate speech, all that sort of stuff that's either against official set of rules or guidelines, either the law itself or the rules of your organization. But then there's the cultural side of moderation, and that's the community standards, and they're going to overlap a lot of the stuff that the things that are regulatory should hopefully also be included in those community standards. But there may be different ones. Your community might really not tolerate or like profanity, and that's not against the law, but it's just kind of not done. So if someone is excessively profane, you might choose to moderate that because it's your community's standards. So, and I think that's actually an important piece of community management, and giving that community a sense of ownership as well. So, if you do the two in concert, think about what are the rules we have to have from a regulatory standpoint, and what's the cultural side of moderation for us as well. I think that's a really important distinction. Amber's raised a great point too, which is a really good tip of, all of, you know, when something happens, when something goes wrong, as you said, sometimes it's a hide and delete situation. Sometimes you just step up and remind people of guidelines and point them back to that and actually have a conversation about it. And that can be a, you know, a teachable moment, as they say. Does anyone have any final questions before we wrap up? And Rod and Nicolle, do you have any parting tips that you'd like to give everybody? If there's, you know, one thing they can do for their resilience in 2021, what would it be?
Get a dog.
Rod's obviously not kept up all night by a puppy.
Brilliant reply.
I think on a company level, just having a top-down culture that promotes discussion of well-being, I think it's so vital to getting anywhere in all of this. If it's not top-down, you start, like, you're not going to be in a position where you want to talk to your manager, or you as a manager, your staff aren't going to want to talk to you. So it needs to be both ways. It needs to be a two-way conversation. Yeah,
absolutely. I could not agree more. Thank you both so much for spending time with us today. It's been awesome. We've got so much to learn from you. And, you know, I've always been in awe of the great work over at the ABC. I've had the great pleasure of working with you all quite closely. And, you know, you are leading the way. And I think you are the biggest employer of community managers in Australia now. So that's quite something. So thank you both for sharing your expertise. Have a fantastic year. And everybody for attending, thank you so much. Everybody watching, thanks heaps. For those